Okay, so this one is gonna be the welfare one. And while I have a whole lot of salt in me about this topic, I'm gonna try and keep this as neutral as I can. Whenever you look into welfare as a topic, there tend to be a whole bunch of numbers and things to look at, and there's going to be a bunch of links down in the description. And I believe it was once said, there are lies, there are damn lies, and then there are statistics. And unfortunately, a lot of the information around welfare has to do with statistics, which a lot of people don't trust, and a lot of people also don't know how to read. One thing that I find time and again when I've talked with people about welfare is they say things like, well, the majority of it is people of color, which is not statistically true. The majority of people who receive welfare are what would be identified in my country as white. But when a lot of people look at those stats, they say, but they're under 50%. Being the majority does not mean being 50% or more. It means being the highest percentage. So, yeah, it's under 50% according to a lot of the stats, because most of the other stats are well below that percentage, because there's more than just 3 races in the country. It's not just split up into a couple of other races and then white. There's way more people than that. It's a vast misunderstanding of what race is, and the sheer racism around the topic is kinda cringeworthy. So, I'm not going to be going over a lot of statistics and figures in this one. That's going to be down in the description. It's going to be in all the links below. Because the real questions about welfare and who deserves it, how it should be given, etc., they matter more from a philosophical and social sense than from a mathematical sense. So what do I mean by that? Well, welfare as we know it, the social safety net, is meant to be a means by which people who have fallen onto hard times can recover. Just look at the term that's usually used for it, safety net. I have a problem with this term. I really do. And it's actually really simple. Fact is, in my country, the social safety net is not a net. It's a ladder. It is a ladder that you can use to pull yourself back up. Why is that a problem? Because it pretty much forces you to hit bottom before you can grab on and try and pull yourself back. Most of these programs, you can't even sign up for them until you would already qualify, which means however long it takes to get your hearing about receiving the program, you were in need and not getting assistance, which can be utterly damning. It really can. It can take over a month just to get heard, just to get all the paperwork filed and go and turn it in and talk to someone to see about, okay, what do I even qualify for? Because most people, when they think about the welfare system, they only have a half dozen to a dozen programs in mind. There are actually over 80. And some things that count as welfare really don't seem like they should be welfare. Like the earned income tax credit is listed as part of welfare. The child tax credit is listed as a kind of welfare. In fact, a lot of tax credits are actually considered welfare, which seems very wrong when you actually say it out loud. And it really puts into perspective something. If tax credits and subsidies are a form of welfare, then people are not getting the bulk of welfare in my country. Companies are. Businesses make more from various subsidies and tax credits than our people do. That seems wrong in my head. I might be in the minority in that, but that just feels bad, man. Feels so very wrong. So, what about welfare? This thing, this monolith that is talked about in broad strokes all the time by all sorts of politicians. What is it really? How is it implemented? Why is it a thing? The vast majority of the way that welfare is implemented is through means-tested application, where they take your information and they compare it to a list of various stats and decide you qualify for X, Y, Z, maybe, if you're lucky, hopefully. Because some of these stats are really, really low. Like, super low. Like, I'm not sure if an economist got anywhere near this determination kind of low. Like, I want to say I was told during my conversation with one of the assistants at the office that you're not supposed to have more than $3,000 in liquid assets. That also means cash on hand. That's really small, especially when economists say to be even remotely safe, you need to have at least a month's worth of savings in hand in case of emergencies. Okay, so that includes your rent, your utilities, your transport cost, and your food cost. So take your rent, take all your bills, your water, your electricity, gas, your phone, all of that, take that, add that to your thing. Your transport, which might be your car payment, plus its insurance. And if you don't have a car, it's going to be all your fees that you pay to get around to wherever you need to go in your city. And then take your food cost and see what that adds up to. Just those handful of things, not all of the other miscellaneous stuff that you might buy in a month. Just your housing, your utilities, your transport, and your food. I'm betting most of you are gonna have over $2,000 in that. Probably higher. So if that's supposed to be your emergency fund, if that's supposed to be one of those points that a lot of people are like, you should have this as a backup to be considered anywhere remotely close to safe, not stable, not secure, just you're not going to completely fall apart after an emergency, limiting your cash on hand to $3,000 or under to receive welfare suddenly sounds really, really, really damning. It's a very, very, very small amount. And I don't know what it is in other states. It might be higher in other states. Goodness, I hope it is higher in other places because this is actually one of the lower cost of living areas. So some people are like, well, that seems fine. People who are receiving welfare, they really shouldn't have much as a fallback. That's the whole point, is to help the poor. If you have that fallback, then you're not really poor, right? But you are. That's the problem. It might take more than a month just to get assistance. In fact, in many cases, it will take more than a month to get assistance. So even if you had that small buffer, you're running on fumes by the time that you might get anything. Simply meaning that the way our welfare system is set up right now, it forces people to hit the bottom before they can get help. And then the second you start getting remotely safe or stable, it just comes out from under you, which creates this repetitive cycle of climbing the ladder and hitting essentially an oil slick that forces you back down. It's a really weird way to handle it. And some of our welfare programs have lifetime limits, which to me, I didn't even realize that before going into this research. That the fact that you can have a lifetime limit for assistance seems counterintuitive to the concept of assistance. Because if you still need the assistance, when you hit that lifetime limit and it disappears, what happens to you? You're just cut off with nothing. So how can we make this system better? Because obviously there's flaws. This is not a safety net, it is a torn up net that at best acts as a ladder. What can we do to make it better? Well, I hold to the argument that there should be some standard amount of assistance that everyone qualifies for regardless. Something universal. Note, this is in my universal basic income playlist. Because to me, a basic income, a guaranteed minimum quality of life income, is a much more effective safety net than the vast majority of these programs. Because you're not going to have to waste time with weeks to months of having to go through bureaucratic bullshit to get assistance. It will just be a stable little trickle that's always there, always going to be there. And you don't have to go through submitting paperwork and keeping up with your records. In fact, a lot of what is reviewed for assistance, the government has these records. When I went and talked to them, they had my records already, except for the actual medical stuff. They had all of my financial stuff on file. In theory, everything about it could have been automated. There could have been a computer program going, okay, this person hasn't worked in this long. and prompted the government to check on my situation, if not automatically sent out assistance. That would significantly improve the situation. Because a lot of people don't realize when they qualify for something. We have over 80 programs of assistance. Most people are maybe gonna know like 8 of them, less, probably. Because there are some weird things listed as part of the welfare system. Most people realize that Medicaid is on it, and Medicaid is actually the largest component of it. So that's healthcare, most often for children. People under 18 make up the majority of Medicaid. So that, I find it really hard for anyone to argue that we should be letting children suffer. Most people aren't upset about Medicaid. They think it's fine. Okay, well, what about Head Start? Apparently, it's a welfare-based program. It's considered part of the social safety net. Head Start for little bitty kids, toddlers, preschoolers. That's part of our social safety net. Their school lunch programs are part of the social safety net. In fact, nutrition-based programs are one of the next largest portions of our social safety net. Medicaid, housing assistance, and nutrition-based programs, food assistance, are the biggest components of it. Everything else is relatively small. Unemployment, temporary assistance, those sorts of things, they're on the list, but most security assistance is small. You have SSI and SSDI, your social security income stuff, but for disabilities, the list it varies by state, for one thing, and it's super incomplete. Anyone who has a disability or has attempted to get assistance for a disability can tell you it is a mess. It's so awkward, it's so weird, and many disabilities are permanent, and yet you have to refile over and over again to continue getting your assistance. As far as like some of the other Social Security type things, like the one you rack up from work, if you put in time but don't reach a certain X value, a certain amount of that time, all of the taxes collected from your paycheck just went into the pile. You will never get anything from it. You won't even get like a small lump sum back. It's just gone. So if you don't hit that X value for whatever reason, because you've been disabled, you took time off to raise children, you took time to be an in-house provider for some other family member. Notice that a lot of these hit the elderly and the disabled or female population. Yeah, a lot of the time that whole SSI just it doesn't show up for you. You end up having to wait until a potential spouse starts drawing theirs. And then you might get something from it. But that's unreliable at best. I mean, it would be wonderful if we could start getting credit for in-home work onto that sort of system. But that's not how it is right now. And that kind of disconnect between the reality of how people live their lives and how these systems are put together is part of what makes them so ineffectual. Some of the systems in welfare include like retraining programs and grants to try and go to school. But those programs tend to be deeply flawed. Retraining historically just doesn't work. It has a very low efficiency rate. Now, if you go to school, there's a lot more success there, but it's still not as much. And some of these grants you might have to, well, some of them are more loans. Kind of depends on what you get. Some of these programs are just so deeply intrinsically flawed that they need to be completely revamped. And that is part of what a UBI would really help us do, is it would give us a buffer zone to reform a great deal of the safety net. A UBI also might make it so that enrollment in some of these programs goes significantly down, which will free up their resources to sustain the UBI. But part of the problem right now with the safety nets is they're very parental. They're very guided. You have lots of limits on what you can do with your given assistance. And because a lot of them are managed state by state, they also typically lock you into not being sure if something will carry over. So even if you could potentially go be in a better situation elsewhere, you can't necessarily go after it without the risk of losing your assistance. There's so many little flaws in the system. It's an old patchwork of concepts and ideas that have good basis, but the implementation is intrinsically flawed. We should have a social safety net. We should have a net that actually catches people before they hit rock bottom. And I believe that a universal basic income would achieve that. Now, some people do argue that a universal basic income would be a Trojan horse to allow people to just start cutting away at these social assistance programs. And I hear that argument. I get it. I understand that fear. But a lot of the statistics point to that a great deal of people who currently should be receiving assistance are not. And I really have to ask, if you're so worried about the people who are currently receiving assistance, what about the people who should be and aren't because these assistance programs are so broken? Are you going to rule out the hope for universal assistance on a worry that something is going to happen to the current one, when there is nothing about universal income that says that these things need to be mutually exclusive? Many of these programs could be sustained. They just probably won't have a point. Many of these programs are so flawed and difficult to get on that receiving a basic income might well make a lot of people just quit bothering with them. Especially if you make it so that the direct cash-like programs are the ones most easily rolled into a basic income. It would be so much more effective for so many people if things like food stamps were just cash. That would make things so much easier for so many people. Because if you haven't been on it, there are massive problems with food stamps. And if you have, even if they really helped, think of how much more they could have helped if it had just been, at least half of it had been cash. It would have changed the things you were allowed to buy with it so much and made it so much easier to use, so much less time consuming. It would have been simpler. And admittedly, any kind of social assistance is gonna be complicated. But the simpler we can make it, the more user-friendly we can turn it into being, the more widely accessible and helpful it'll be. Even if maybe you think that a basic income should not be entirely universal and that it should only go to people under a certain level, making it simple, making it cash for what is needed by them that they understand way better than any amount of bureaucracy and governmental oversight can understand, is better than this very mismatched, fragmented thing that we currently have. I mean, there's a whole bunch of arguments that can be had about how the means testing eats a massive chunk of the funding for these programs. The means testing eats just so much of what is supposed to be set aside for these programs. But even if you think there should be means testing, I find it really hard to argue that a basic flat rate of assistance isn't better than what we have right now. Even if you want it segmented off into what kind of assistance do you need, giving it as bundles of cash that don't have to be limited to just that one thing would still increase efficiency and simplicity of the programs overall. So, yeah, welfare versus universal basic income, for me, personally, it's not a question. It would ease my mind so much to know that the people I care about who need assistance will just simply have it there. When they need it, it's there. When it's a little bit more than absolute need, they can save it for in case, for if there is an emergency. That is just so much greater to me, and that's where I stand on it. Basic income, regardless of how you would prefer it implemented, just seems like the much better way to do this thing, to make it happen, make it work, and have it be sustainable, because the efficiency is with raw cash. But I can't change opinions. I can just help inform them. So, bye.